Good morning, and welcome to the first day of the Texas Tribune Festival. I'm Garrett Graff, and I am very pleased to be here for what I think will be a highlight of the festival. I have with me here today the most famous intern for Spiro Agnew, and as a Watergate historian, I'm so excited that so many of you wanted to turn out today for our hour-long discussion about the life and legacy of Vice President Spiro Agnew. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes this morning, and then take questions from the audience. You can submit your questions online at texastribune.org/ask. And then they will be read by one of our Texas Tribune colleagues here for Ambassador Bolton. You can submit those questions at any time, so if you have questions right now, you can get in the queue whenever you're ready. I'm also supposed to remind you to silence your cell phones. If your cell phone rings during the event, Ambassador Bolton will answer it personally and then conduct the conversation live on the microphone. So you do not want that to happen. So I want to start actually this morning with a little bit of a preamble, which is for obvious reasons, Ambassador Bolton cannot talk about some of the latest headlines that he has made this fall regarding the criminal charges brought by the Trump Justice Department. So there's a reason why I am skipping that as an opening topic this morning. So understanding that, setting that aside and then setting up my first question for you this morning is...
I might just say there, I'd actually be delighted to talk about the subject, but it's unfortunately not appropriate. And you know, when I was an intern for Spiro Agnew, who later faced his own problems with the Justice Department, interns didn't get paid very much in the summer of '72 when I was an intern in the Nixon White House. So I'd like to say I emerged from that job poor but unindicted. And unfortunately, I didn't make it out of the Trump administration that way, but we'll see.
Yeah. So setting that aside, I understand is in some ways like asking Mary Todd Lincoln for her review of Ford's Theater, except for that one little thing. But let's start by talking about Donald Trump's second term and his foreign policy this morning. You wrote in your book, your memoir, The Room Where It Happened, that part of the challenge of Donald Trump is that he has no political philosophy and does not have policies in the way that we traditionally understand them. He cares almost exclusively about his own interests. And you predicted that Donald Trump's, his second term would be very much like his first in key ways. And yet, while that's true to a certain extent, it certainly feels like this year has been different for the country and the world than the first 4 years of Donald Trump. And I wonder if you could start off with just a broad reaction to his foreign policy of this second term and how you view it differently or the same as the 453 days that you spent as his national security advisor in the first term?
Well, I think the key point is in appreciating that Trump doesn't have a philosophy. Certainly in national security, he doesn't do grand strategy. And as I said before, he doesn't do policy. It's very hard for people to understand. It was very hard for me to understand because you think in government, well, that's what it's about. Policy is what you do. That's not what Donald Trump does. And therefore, when people talk about a Trump doctrine in international affairs, it's a complete fantasy to think that there's any coherence to it at all. It's all through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. And I think one key difference in the second term is that In the first term, there were a lot of people who thought they were coming into sort of a traditional Republican administration and offered their views on all kinds of different policy questions that just Trump thought got in the way of what he wanted to do. It wasn't that people were trying to restrain him from making a particular decision. It was they thought that the president should make informed decisions, that he should have information that would help guide his decisions. He would want alternatives. He would want the pluses and minuses of the different alternatives. And in fact, he didn't want any of that. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. And so in the second term, he made a concerted effort to make sure that the people he brought in would simply respond to his neuron flashes and not bring up pesky information or alternatives or cost-benefit analysis. He wanted yes men and yes women, and that's pretty much what he got. So a lot of what you see now in public in Trump, we saw in private, but we were still thinking, well, maybe he ought to know this fact or that fact or the other fact. There was never any question in anybody's mind in the first term that obviously the president was going to make the final decision. The idea that we were going to make decisions for him is just a complete misreading of what happened. We just thought maybe he'd like to know a few things before he made decisions. You just can't really fully appreciate how little he knew about critically important subjects. He once asked John Kelly, when Kelly was chief of staff, is Finland still part of Russia? We were visiting Theresa May, then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. She took him out to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. We were out there talking, and just a few weeks before his visit, the Russians had attempted to poison 2 Russian exiles, the Skripals, a father and daughter who had broken with the regime and sought exile in the United Kingdom. And one of Theresa May's advisors said, we took that attack of poisoning very seriously. It was a chemical weapons attack by one nuclear power on another nuclear power. And Trump looked at Theresa May and said, oh, do you have nuclear weapons? So when I say that, there's some information gaps here that we were trying to deal with, that they were real. He doesn't want information. He wants to do what he wants to do, and he has people around him who are prepared to say, yes, sir.
And that's really one of the big critiques that you have of the way that we look back on that first administration, was that the sort of presenting hypothesis or thesis of those first couple of years of the administration was that there was this axis of adults around him that constrained him and kept him from doing the worst things that he wanted to do. Your view, though, when you stepped into the White House in 2018 following General McMaster as National Security Advisor, was that you actually thought that the axis of adults hadn't constrained him enough, that there sort of wasn't enough policy and procedure around him that they had sort of put into place. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about how you had tried to approach that as you stepped in, and sort of what your diagnosis was and how you tried to fix it.
Right. Well, I started in April of 2018, so more than a year after Trump was sworn in. And part of the problem with the axis of adults, as people called it back then, was they kept telling the press how much smarter they were than the president. And needless to say, he didn't appreciate it, but it made him more suspicious of others on his own team who weren't trying to lead him down a garden path. They were just trying to make sure that he had information and heard the arguments pro and con. You can be philosophically on the same page on an issue, but have very different views on how to operationalize a policy and what the risks were and what the predicate steps were to make the policy a success. That's just part of government that I think he never really saw. A lot of people ask me, well, you must have seen what the problem with Trump was. Why did you go to work for him? And I had met Trump before on a number of occasions before he took office and after he took office. And so, I've been criticized for a lot of things. Few people have ever called me naive. I thought I knew what I was getting into, but I was guided by a basic belief that like every one of his predecessors, Trump would be disciplined by the weight of the responsibilities he had, certainly in the national security space, and by the gravity of the consequences that some of those decisions would imply, and that all of that significance would affect him. It would bring discipline to his thinking, and he would make the final decisions, but we'd have an orderly process, which is what the whole concept of the National Security Council was when it was established by Congress in 1947, that the U.S. post-World War II was in a very different position in the world than it had ever been before. It was very complicated. It was very dangerous. The president needed the coordinated actions of the entire U.S. government to protect American interest around the world. So that's what the National Security Council was for. And I thought that all of this process and the gravity of the responsibilities, as I say, would discipline Trump's thinking. And I turned out to be completely wrong. Nothing disciplined his thinking, and didn't in the first term. It has not in the first year of the second term.
So let me ask you a little bit about Marco Rubio. When you were National Security Advisor, were there any days that you sort of sat around in the White House and you're like, I am really bored and I have nothing to do, and I wish that I was also Secretary of State and the Archivist of the United States, because I definitely have time to do those jobs as well?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a problem of the second Trump term that is going to have adverse consequences for the country as time goes on. As I say, the National Security Council, and particularly the role of the National Security Advisor, is to strengthen the president's hand over the bureaucracy. It's so vast and so uncoordinated. It's not because there's some conspiracy in the deep state to run the country. I mean, if there were a conspiracy, it would involve too many people. Somebody would talk. We would know about it. The fact is, bureaucracies have their own cultures. They go off in their own direction. The Defense Department thinks differently from the Treasury Department or the State Department. And the point of the National Security Council is to bring things together. But Trump didn't see it that way. He didn't understand the need for coordination, because he figured, after all, he would make all the decisions, and he didn't need to know that much to begin with. I think we've seen in a number of examples in the first year of the second term where the lack of coordination among the different government departments and agencies has led to mistakes in policies being announced, then being retracted. This lack of coordination sounds bureaucratic, and it is to an extent, but it's critical to have effective long-term application of American power to protect American interests. I have a great deal of respect for Marco Rubio. I've known him for a long time. I worked with him in different roles when he was in the Senate. But only one person before has ever held both the National Security Advisor job and Secretary of State, and that was Henry Kissinger. And as I say, with all due respect to Marco, he's not Henry Kissinger. And even Henry Kissinger had to give it up after a while, because other elements of the government said he's not the president's advisor, he's the Secretary of State, and he's pushing things in the direction that he wants them to go in, which was absolutely true. So this unwillingness to have a disciplined process reflects a mind that's just not willing to be disciplined, and it's not focused on American national security. It's focused on what the president wants to do at any given moment.
I want to start moving around the world a little bit and talking about some of the hot spots that we are facing right now. And I want to start in Venezuela. You have an op-ed actually in the Washington Post today, a op-ed page that, probably much to your confusion, I now believe sits to your right on the American political spectrum. And Venezuela was a subject that you spent a lot of time on in your time in the White House. Make the case for why Maduro needs to go, but why this is the wrong way to do it.
Well, I think what's happened in Venezuela since the Chavez dictatorship took over during the Bush 43 administration, and what happened since then after his death under Maduro, has been absolutely devastating for the people of Venezuela. Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in this hemisphere. When you come to the period in 2018, 2019, during the first Trump term, Venezuela was actually producing roughly 1/3 of the oil that it produced in the 1940s. 1/3. which obviously has a significant negative impact on the wealth of the country and the income of the people because of the Chavez-Maduro dictatorship and the way it had run the oil industry into the ground. But there were also key American national security interests involved. The Russians, the Cubans, acting as their surrogates, had gotten very significant advantages in Venezuela. The Chinese, always looking for new energy sources, were involved. Iran had its largest embassy in the world in Caracas because they used that embassy to launder their own sanctioned oil revenues into international markets through the Venezuelan banks. So there were enormous American national security interests there as well that led us in 2018 and 2019 to support the Venezuelan opposition, which used Chavez's own constitution to point out that Maduro stealing the election in 2018 meant he could not be president under the Constitution, declaring a vacancy and having the national legislature make Juan Guaido the president. So we worked with the opposition to overthrow Maduro. It didn't work for a variety of reasons, but it was the right thing to do. And it's the right thing to do today because the circumstances in Venezuela are even worse than they were in 2018 and 2019. And the role of the Russians, the Cubans, the Chinese, the Iranians is even greater. The issue is, are we pursuing an effective strategy to overthrow Maduro? Are we aligned with the Venezuelan opposition? Are we really in tune with what they want to do and how they think the most effective way to proceed is? Do we have the same kind of international coalition in support of overthrowing Maduro we did in 2018, 2019? The answer to that is we do not. Do we know what we're doing when we shoot these drug boats out of the water? Or are we merely signaling to Russia and China more may be coming, which induces them to be even more prepared? Do we know why we've brought the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean? What I sense is that there's no underlying strategy here. And I will say, I think that our failure to overthrow Maduro in the first term was our greatest failure. And we owe it to ourselves and the Venezuelan people to get it right this time. And we're not right now doing that. It's not too late to correct it, but right now there's just no comprehension, I think, of what it takes to replace the Maduro regime, which would be in our national security interest and in the interest of the Venezuelan people to do.
Do you, across your career and the posts that you have held, know international law and the laws of war about as well as anyone? Do you consider the strikes on the drug boats or the alleged drug boats to be legal?
Well, I don't think they're consistent with our interest. International law, part of its problem is it's so fuzzy, you can make it appear a lot of different ways. I think our military is following orders from the commander-in-chief, and there has been an opinion from the Justice Department that protects them from prosecution, but it doesn't look good. And frankly, it's not consistent with our own long-standing efforts in the United States to separate the function of the military from the function of law enforcement. We believe that very strongly domestically. It comes from the revolution. We didn't like British troops enforcing laws in Boston and New York and other American cities. That's why we've got the Posse Comitatus statute that invokes the military only in extraordinary circumstances. And I think when we confuse legitimate law enforcement objective of preventing illegal narcotics from coming into the country with the national defense of the country, we're confusing two separate concepts and weakening both.
I want to move to nuclear weapons next. President Trump had a meeting with President Xi of China a couple weeks ago, during which he put out a tweet that people have really struggled to make sense of, saying that the U.S. was going to resume nuclear testing. Leaving aside the fact that he said that he'd ordered the Department of Defense to do it, which is not the cabinet department that actually controls the nuclear stockpile, which is controlled by the Department of Energy. Do you think we need to be doing nuclear testing again? How would you look at that in the pantheon of our geopolitical challenges?
Well, another problem is the Trump administration can't decide what nuclear testing means, whether it's a test of systems or whether it's an actual detonation of a nuclear device. The fact is that a number of people have felt for quite some time that we do need a limited number of nuclear tests to make sure that our nuclear weapons inventory is both safe and reliable. And the reason for that is when you create a nuclear weapon, whether you've got enriched uranium or plutonium as the fissile material, it's typically covered by a layer of explosives that the detonation mechanism is the explosives all go off at the same time. It crushes the hollow sphere of uranium or plutonium into a solid ball. That results in critical mass, and the bomb goes off. Now, the fact is, inert high explosive, which is what we use, sitting on top of radioactively decaying uranium and plutonium, is affected by that. And as one nuclear scientist once explained it to me, when you've got a couple thousand nuclear warheads that you want safety and reliability, what that means is, in terms of reliability, it's like having 1,000 automobiles in a parking lot. When you turn the ignition key, you want it to work the first time because you don't get a second time. You want it to work the first time, and you don't want it to ignite when you haven't turned the key. That's the safety part. So you can have the most elaborate algorithms and theories about what's happening to these nuclear weapons as they age, and we've got the best there is, there's no doubt about it. But do you want the safety and reliability of the deterrent, which is our major defense against hostile activity, based on algorithms, or would you like to test it every once in a while to see what's going on? And that's really all that a nuclear test or two would be about. It's to make sure that people believe the deterrent is reliable so that when we need it, it will work. And they need to know it's safe so that it's not a danger to ourselves here at home. It's been said that nobody's testing, but that's not true. This gets into a little bit of arcana about what yield is in a test, but over time, a lot of people have written about the Russians and the Chinese testing at low yields. We have not been doing that. So there actually is a good case to be made to convince people, our friends and allies, that our deterrent is effective and they don't need to get their own nuclear weapons capabilities. I don't think Trump understands any of this, but there's still a good reason to do it.
And sticking with nuclear weapons, I want to ask you a question about Iran, which you are probably the most famous Iran hawk in the world. And you pushed when you were National Security Advisor to exit the Iranian nuclear deal in the first Trump term. What do you make of the strikes that the U.S. and Israel did on the Iranian nuclear program this year? Was that a smart decision? Would you have done it yourself? And what message do you think Iran has taken away from those strikes?
Right. Well, I felt for a long time we would be justified in eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons program. It is a threat to international peace and security. It's specifically a threat against Israel, whom the Iranians call the little Satan, but against us, whom the Iranians call the great Satan. Israel is a very small country, half a dozen nuclear weapons. There is no more Israel. That's why they see it correctly as an existential threat. And we've tried a variety of ways for a long period of time to convince the Ayatollahs not to build nuclear weapons. We've never succeeded at any of it. So it finally came in the wake of October the 7th, which was really the attack on Israel was part of a larger Iranian strategy. They themselves called it the Ring of Fire strategy to sponsor terrorist groups all around Israel, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militia groups in Iraq, dissidents in the West Bank. And this was really aimed at ultimately weakening or destroying Israel. So it shouldn't have come to anybody as a surprise that at some point Israel said, we're going to go after the real problem here. As Alexander Haig used to say when he was Secretary of State, go to the source. And the source of October 7 was Iran. So I think the attack on the nuclear program by the Israelis was correct. I think the U.S. should have joined it at the beginning, and I think the problem with it was that it ended too soon. And we can see already that Iran is trying to rebuild, recreate the nuclear weapons program. So we've damaged it significantly. We could have done a lot more. We should have done a lot more. Somebody's going to have to do more in the very near future.
What message do you think Iran took away from those strikes, though? Do you think that ultimately is a discouragement to them, or do you think it will encourage them to accelerate efforts to build a weapon more clandestinely?
Well, I think the regime in power obviously has decided that because we stopped too soon, they could recreate the capacity, which they're trying to do at two relatively new sites, not the ones that were bombed, but two additional sites, and they're doing it. More interesting, I think, is the reaction of the Iranian people that we've discerned from a number of different sources, which has actually increased the view in Iran that the regime's days are numbered, because what the Israeli-U.S. attack showed was that the Ayatollahs could not protect their crown jewels. They couldn't protect the nuclear or ballistic missile program. The tragedy is that this instability that the attack caused could have been made even more significant if we had finished it up, which we didn't do. So you can talk about a 12-day war by Israel and the U.S. all you want. This war began on October the 7th, and it's not going to end, and there won't be a chance for peace and security in the Middle East for Israel or anybody else until the Ayatollahs are overthrown and you get a regime that doesn't pursue their radical ideology.
China. What has Donald Trump gotten right about reassessing the U.S. relationship with China?
Well, I think for many years there was a view that inevitably the economic reforms that Deng Xiaoping began in the mid-1980s, moving away from the Cultural Revolution, abandoning key precepts of Marxism, creating market mechanisms. Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, meaning it's, you can get rich being a socialist, you can get rich being a capitalist. And in the West as a whole, we thought, well, that's a good thing. Jettisoning Marxist economic principles will lead to two things. One, greater economic growth, and therefore a middle class in China. The country will become more democratic internally, and it will become more responsible internationally. That was what our policy was based on for a long time. And it wasn't Trump who came up with the analysis, but many people across the political spectrum who said basically we were wrong about that. Economic growth in China did not lead to more internal democracy, it led to less. Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, so that the spread of wealth, the creation of a middle class in China didn't lead in a democratic direction, and it certainly didn't lead in the direction of China behaving more responsibly internationally. People said, well, China's engaging in a peaceful rise and it'll be a responsible stakeholder in world affairs. It obviously was not engaging in a peaceful rise. It was is seeking hegemony along its Indo-Pacific periphery and ultimately worldwide. And it was far from being a responsible stakeholder, as we can see from its economic and political behavior all around the world. So our policy since the mid-1980s had failed in very substantial ways, and we needed a new policy. People needed to wake up to the Chinese threat, and that has now happened. But the Trump administration in the first term, and as far as you can tell in the second term, isn't really addressing the overall threat. It's addressing what China has done internationally in terms of trade practices that are harmful to American interest, which is true, and deserve a coherent response, not a worldwide war on trade, but building an alliance of countries that are as negatively affected by China as we are, and working to change China's practices that way. But the broader strategic threat really doesn't figure into Trump's calculation. It leaves people in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East very worried. And if we don't really adjust to the broader strategic Chinese threat, we will continue to operate at a disadvantage really across the spectrum. China's approach is what they call a whole of society approach to national security, and one critical element of that is what they call civil-military fusion, which is a phrase that ought to worry everybody in this room, because it means that the distinction between the military and civilian spheres in China is changing, and that the military aspect is becoming more important, all under the continuing dominance, of course, of the Chinese Communist Party.
Along that same lines, you've noted that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping have been noticeably quiet about Taiwan in their discussions between the two of them. Do you think Donald Trump would stand behind Taiwan? And what is the path that you see to preserving a free and independent Taiwan?
Well, I'm very worried about Taiwan, and it's not just because it makes the computer chips on which our society depends, but because of the effect it would have throughout East, Southeast, and South Asia, and the world as a whole, if Taiwan fell to the communist government in Beijing. In his first term, Trump, at various points, sitting behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, which is a big chunk of wood. I want to tell you, it was a gift of Queen Victoria to the U.S. in the 19th century. It's the most impressive desk you've ever sat behind. But it covers a broad expanse of territory. But he'd sit behind the Resolute desk, and he'd take out one of his Sharpie pens, and he'd point to the tip, and he'd say, "See that? That's Taiwan." Then he'd point to the desk and say, "See that? That's China." Well, that's probably true in terms of geographic metaphors, but and very dispiriting to the people on Taiwan, but it's not an adequate understanding of the strategic relationship we have and the interest we have, and many other countries have, in Taiwan. So I'm worried, and the people of Taiwan are very worried about how this is going to play out. And they're worried that in a trade negotiation, Trump might give up the independence of Taiwan for some Chinese trade concession.
And along those same lines, the Biden administration put an enormous amount of effort into blocking China from purchasing the most advanced computer chips to power some of these new advances in AI. Donald Trump arrived and has negotiated a very strange deal with NVIDIA, where basically the U.S. government gets paid for NVIDIA's ability to export these advanced chips to China. What do you make of that, and is that good for America's security going forward?
Well, the efforts to prevent China from getting high-tech technology really did begin in the first Trump term. But for Trump, everything is a deal, and if he gets money out of it, he regards it as a success. I give the Biden administration credit. They did up the restrictions on trade with China in these technologies, and we have to go back to the real foundation here, is that much of China's economic development has come from stealing intellectual property from the US, Europe, Japan, and others. And it's this intellectual property theft where they take something that we have developed under patent protection with the US and in the Western world, and they just copy it and then mass produce it and sell it into the market at a much lower price. That's the kind of negative behavior we and our friends should be focused on to try and stop that. But that's how China's gotten to the point in information technology that it is today. And there's no upside in assisting them, whether you make money off of it or not, in the artificial intelligence world and in the whole range of information technology issues. This is a critically important race. We've talked about nuclear weapons, but threats across the entire spectrum of these capabilities are something we have to worry about. China is very active right now in influence operations in the United States, in the internet, and many other ways, and giving them the technology that could propel them to greater success in artificial intelligence and a range of other related matters is something that's terribly detrimental to our national security.
The last part of the world I want to ask about before I switch topics a little bit is Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. You have talked about how Donald Trump really embraces the Louis XIV doctrine of l'état c'est moi, that sort of Donald Trump views relationships between nations as basically whether he has a good personal relationship with the leader of that country. And he has had a very chilly relationship this year with Zelensky. Where do you think the American relationship with Ukraine goes, and what message do you think Russia is taking away from where things stand now?
Yeah, this idea that personal relationships between the country's leaders are determinative of the state-to-state relations is a terribly oversimplified view of life. I'm not saying personal relationships don't have some a role in international affairs. They do in everything human beings do. But I'll guarantee you that the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are not based on whether they like Donald Trump or not. They're based on a very hard calculation of what they think Russian and Chinese national interests are, respectively. Trump doesn't think that way. He said after his first meeting with Kim Jong-un, for example, in Singapore to discuss the North Korean nuclear weapons program, he came out and told the press that we fell in love. Well, I watched Kim Jong-un very carefully in the course of their meetings, and he's about as cold-blooded as a person as I've ever seen. He didn't fall in love with anybody at that encounter. And when you think in those terms, you're inevitably going to get it wrong. So when you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, an act of unprovoked aggression in 2014, Russia was pursuing what Vladimir Putin and his government felt was a critical objective for them, recreating the Russian Empire. The Ukrainians, which is illegitimate and an act of unprovoked aggression that got this started back in 2014, the Ukrainians think they're fighting for their freedom and independence. Remember when we did that? Donald Trump has called the war senseless. So if you're a Ukrainian and you hear that, what do you think the U.S. is going to do? And if you're in Moscow and you're Vladimir Putin and you hear that, you know you are yards ahead before you've even opened your mouth. So I think that the idea that somehow Trump was going to bring peace between Russia and China, as he said during the 24 campaign, in 24 hours, that was never going to happen. But it's been nearly a year now, and it hasn't happened either. And the reason is that for very different causes, Ukraine and Russia both think they have a lot of stake at this. And the question is not whether Trump thinks Vladimir Putin, his friend, is going to help him make a peace deal, but what American national interests at stake are. And the biggest national interest we have is that an act of unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe endangers the post-World War II peace that we created with some of our closest friends and biggest trading partners. And if unprovoked aggression can be seen to succeed on the continent of Europe, anywhere else in the world is in jeopardy, particularly Taiwan. But the conclusion that's drawn around the world is the U.S. isn't going to come to the defense of a democracy in Central Europe where it has so much at stake. It's not going to come to anybody else's aid anywhere else in the world.
We're going to open it up to questions in about 5 minutes here. A reminder that you can submit questions at texastribune.org/ask if you want to get your questions in now so that we have some in the queue. I want to switch and talk a little bit about the broader questions that the country faces right now about Donald Trump's presidency. And one of the things I've been writing about this fall is, Donald Trump's reign will eventually reach an actuarial conclusion in American politics. That this is a situation where Donald Trump's sort of continued influence in American politics will be measured in years, not decades. This is not a situation where we have Franco settling in Spain for 40 years. What do you hope emerges from the post-Trump Republican Party? I mean, you've spent 50 years in Republican politics. We just saw Dick Cheney, one of the, your former colleague, die last year. It's one of the most prominent Republican figures of the 21st century who cast his final presidential vote for a Democrat. Where does the Republican Party go from where we are right now?
Well, I don't agree with the commentators who have said that the Republican Party is now Trump's party. I think whether it's in Congress or around the country, it remains basically a Reagan party. And because Trump has no philosophy, he has nothing but a behavioral pattern to pass on to his would-be successors. I think a terrible pattern of behavior, but it's not a coherent philosophy, and the MAGA base is not terribly coherent. I think a lot of members of Congress, House and Senate, have not spoken up against Trump when he does things that are manifestly not conservative. I think that's bad, but I suppose there's good news and bad news. The good news is they don't really believe what he's doing. The bad news is they're intimidated by him. And this manifests itself in a lot of ways, and I think just two examples. One, the tariff policy is not the Republican policy of free trade, and everybody knows it. We've made some mistakes. We have not defended ourselves against China's predatory practices as well as we should have, and we have not paid attention to supply chain issues where certain critical elements of the defense supply chain are made in places like China. But that can be corrected without a trade war of a Hobbesian war of all against all, which is what Trump has unleashed. And you can see how upset he was when the province of Ontario did an ad opposing our tariffs that, my God, had footage of Ronald Reagan explaining why tariffs were a bad idea. Imagine. So Trump got irritated to that. We don't want this guy Reagan out there explaining why tariffs are bad. It's not a conservative approach to trade that Trump has taken. And if you look at what he's done in trying to federalize the National Guard and put them in the streets of Portland or Chicago or wherever the case may be, that's not conservative either. Conservatives believe in the division of powers between the states and the federal government. We believe that power is best exercised by the governments closest to the peoples, the cities and the counties first, the states second, the federal government only at the last resort. Trump wants to make Donald Trump and the National Guard the first resort. That's not conservative either. This is not going to last in the Republican Party. And so I think there is a struggle that will ensue, and I think as Trump is increasingly seen as a lame duck president in his second term, that the party will snap back at some point to being the Reaganite party. I think it still is.
Who do you hope emerges as that leader, as the next standard bearer?
Well, I wouldn't want to put anybody in an adverse position by endorsing them and having Trump single them out for the next 3 years. But I think there are a lot more than he thinks, and I think we're going to have in both parties really very, very active campaigns for the 28 nomination.
Speaking of the Republican Party and Dick Cheney, his death last week brought up a lot of questions and discussion about the legacy of the Iraq War. As you look back on that 22-ish years now, do you have regrets about your role in that war, and how do you think about that war's legacy today?
Well, I think it's very badly misunderstood, and I do think that in the Bush 43 administration we made mistakes, but overthrowing Saddam Hussein was not one of the mistakes. This guy was a threat who was on the verge of getting rid of UN sanctions and UN weapons inspectors. I could go on at length on the question of weapons of mass destruction. I'll just give you one point to keep in mind. It's very important, is that even though at the time that the second Gulf War was launched, there were no centrifuges spinning, enriching uranium or anything like that, nonetheless, Saddam Hussein had kept together some 3,000 nuclear scientists and technicians whom he called his nuclear mujahideen, that had the intellectual capability to recreate the nuclear program from scratch. And he was waiting for the opportunity when the UN had been removed from Iraq to begin the program again. So I think the elimination of Saddam was the right thing to do. I think the mistake we made was in the post-war effort where we created the Coalition Provisional Authority and tried to help the Iraqis create a new government. I think we would have been better advised to convene a broad spectrum of Iraqi leaders and say, congratulations, we've removed Saddam, you form the next government. I don't think you enhance political maturation in a people by making decisions for them. I think you enhance political maturation by telling them to make decisions for themselves. And I think if we had done that, we would have had a better outcome. But in terms of removing Saddam Hussein, I don't have any regrets at all.
Let me open it up to questions. I think the moderator will be up over here. Reminder, you can submit your questions at texastribune.org/ask.
Hi, and welcome. I'm Terry Langford, the Health Services reporter at Texas Tribune. First question from Danette from Austin is, Ambassador Bolton, in your view, what is the actual national security threat at the U.S.-Mexico border? Specifically, which risks are real, and which ones do you believe are being conflated or overstated in the public discussion?
Well, I don't think there are any national security threats at the Mexico-U.S. border. I think there are two kinds of problems that we have. One is the illegal drug problem, which needs to be handled through law enforcement and cooperation with the government of Mexico. We have shown over the years through Plan Colombia under the George W. Bush administration and others that when you work cooperatively with a government that's part of the drug supply chain, that you can have successes. And I think we could do the same in Mexico, but treating it as a national security threat, threatening the use of force without coordinating with the government of Mexico is going to further destabilize the government of Mexico, which the drug cartels have already been doing. It wouldn't work out. I don't think illegal immigration is a threat, a national security threat, because I think it can be contained, and Trump has basically done it twice in closing the border. There is a national security aspect because if the border's wide open, other countries will try and get espionage agents, terrorists could come through, that sort of thing. So, but that's not something that requires the militarization of the border. I personally believe that our policy should favor enhanced legal immigration from many countries around the world. We're a great country because we come from so many different places. I want more talented people to come to the United States. They don't take jobs away from Americans. They help create more jobs. Economic growth is a good thing. The caveat is we decide who gets in, not the would-be immigrants. I think if people were willing to stand in line, fill out a form, and wait their turn, we'd have a lot of people coming in that would be very beneficial. So I'm pro-legal immigration, against illegal immigration, but I don't think you treat immigrants as a national security problem.
Next question is from... Next question from Jennifer from Austin. What does it mean to you to put principles first in this second Trump term? Would you hope to see more first-term alumni speaking out?
Yes, definitely. Look, I got involved in politics at a very early age. I was a volunteer handing out leaflets outside a precinct voting place in 1964 for Barry Goldwater. I've been a conservative for a long time, as you can see, and what motivated me in politics was principle. It was not a cult of personality around some political leader. And I think the country would benefit from talking about principles, having disagreements on policy, debating the policies, and stop wondering what Donald Trump thought about it, because I think that's frankly irrelevant.
Along those lines, when you think back to your own role in the first term, you think back particularly to, for instance, the first impeachment. Do you have any regrets about anything that you wish you had done differently, either in the first term or after the first term, that you think might have helped sort of draw the nation's attention to the problems of Trump, to help stop him, or to help Republicans support that first impeachment?
Well, I think the realization that Trump was not going to be disciplined in his thinking about national security was so stunning to me that it took a while to understand kind of how to react to it. And I'm sure I made an awful lot of mistakes during the 17 months I was National Security Advisor. Because dealing with somebody who didn't care about policy, who was focused only on themselves, was different than any other experience I had ever had in the government. And so I lasted as long as I thought I could. I do want to say I am, and remain to this day, Trump's longest-serving national security advisor.
Tallest midget supply here.
Yeah. But it obviously didn't have the effect that I wanted. I don't think anything was going to change the outcome in the first impeachment over Ukraine. And for people who said, well, you should have testified, all I can say is I don't think it would have any effect. And, you know, the Democrats never subpoenaed me. I mean, their whole impeachment effort, I thought, was impeachment malpractice, as demonstrated by their unwillingness to work across the aisle and bring Republicans, at least some Republicans, along, as the Democrats did very effectively against Nixon in his impeachment.
Our next question comes from Scott from Virginia. Ambassador Bolton, with the cuts during Trump 2.0 to U.S. aid and other international NGOs funding, is the U.S. abdicating its soft power influence in the world, and is soft power still an effort worth pursuing?
Yeah, you know, I'm an alumnus of the Agency for International Development in Reagan's first term. That was my first big job in the federal government, two jobs there from 1981 to 1983. And, you know, there were a lot of things in the foreign aid program that needed fixing. We tried to fix them. That's what Reagan wanted us to do. But he understood, both with respect to bilateral assistance to countries and with respect to America's information statecraft capability, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Voice of America, a whole range of other assets that we had, that these were ways to help persuade people around the world to come to the side of the United States and to show through programs like AID how to build an economy like ours that would increase the wealth available to their people. And I don't doubt over many years that more reforms and changes could have been made, but I don't think you disarm yourself unilaterally, either in terms of bilateral economic assistance or in information. We have left a vacuum in the world for the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, that eventually will replace these capabilities that Trump has eliminated, but we are losing right now because we're not on the playing field in many countries around the world. It's totally self-defeating.
Related to that, let's spend a minute talking about the United Nations. In a Republican galaxy long ago and far away, you served as ambassador to the UN. Famously, you survived riding the escalators up and down throughout the building for the duration of your time as ambassador. What do you make of Donald Trump's war with the United Nations right now, and what role do you see the United Nations playing in the modern world?
Yeah, I don't think Trump's view of the United Nations is coherent, because I still don't think he understands what it does. The UN's problem is that it's so vast and sprawling that you have to try and distinguish the pieces that do good work and the pieces that don't do good work. The chief political decision-making bodies, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Commission, are essentially useless. They don't perform the functions they were intended to perform. But there are a number of UN specialized and technical agencies around the world that, if they stick to their knitting and don't get involved in political disputes, produce good results. Often these are the ones that are voluntarily funded: the World Food Program, UNICEF, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And that's what you need to look at. You need to look at it point by point. Jeane Kirkpatrick was one of my predecessors, the first UN ambassador in the Reagan administration, was once asked if the U.S. should withdraw from the UN. And she paused for a moment, and then she said, "No, it's not worth the trouble." And that was really a very insightful point. There are things that we need to protect, and our presence is important. There are others that are not. Trump doesn't, like everything else, he has no strategy. It's whatever hits him on a given day.
Why does he work, though? Sort of what, you've watched him up close, you've watched him from afar, you've been in his tent, you've been outside his tent now. What is your theory about how he has managed to defy political gravity in American politics for a decade?
Well, it is hard to explain, but he has tapped into a very broad streak of popular opinion that among people who feel that they've been disregarded, denigrated really by the American elite, and he embodies their resentments. And he has had the good fortune to run against Democratic candidates who are considered even worse than he is. And so he's won 2 victories. He was defeated once, although he'll never admit it. And actually, if he thought he did win in 2020, he was unconstitutional to elect him again in 2024. But leaving that aside, this is something that's not good for American politics, to be so centered on one individual and to have our political debate so much motivated by personality factors rather than philosophical and issue-oriented factors.
Linda from Austin asks, what singular concern lingers in your thoughts during quiet moments?
Look, I believe the Constitution is strong. I think our institutions are strong. I don't think Donald Trump can destroy him. He's not Catiline. He's not Sulla. He's not Pompey in the days of the Roman Republic. He's sure as hell not Julius Caesar. He's not going to bring the Constitution down. What bothers me is I might be wrong.
I think we've got time for just a few more questions. Phil from Salt Lake City asks, what is the current landscape and potential impacts to national security regarding cybersecurity?
Well, this is, I think, critical for the future. So much of what we do depends on information technology, that making sure we can not only defend our own cyber systems, but have the capability to conduct offensive operations against our enemies. As in any other domain of human activity, cyberspace is not the Garden of Eden. It's not something that we should try and wall off from its use for purposes to defend our interest. I think in a free society, inevitably we should come out on top, but we have to recognize what the dangers are and what the threats are, and not think that somehow cyberspace can't be threatening to us. If we do that adequately, I think we'll be okay. We need a larger defense budget across the board. We don't have that in process right now. The government ends up being shut down. That cuts the Defense Department budget. We need to eliminate federal deficits. We need more defense spending, and that means the arithmetic tells you less spending on domestic programs. It's just that simple.
I think we've got 2 more questions, maybe?
I've got them. Meters from Dallas asks, does J.D. Vance have any policy views, or is the influence of the Trump approach going to lead to a new way of governing?
Well, I think Vance is an incredibly plastic person. He compared Trump to Hitler in the first campaign in 2020, and then when
that was when they were anti-Hitler, also, by
right,
the way.
exactly.
If you have to
Just to
remember
be clear.
that was meant as an insult back then.
And then he wanted to be vice president, so he switched and became a Trumper. So that tells me there's hope for Vance.
Not sure if you can answer this question, but Mark from Austin is asking, what do you think about the indictments of James Comey and Letitia James and the overall approach of the FBI and DOJ under Trump's second administration?
Well, I can say that in January of 2024, in a foreword to the paperback edition of my book, I said then a second Trump term will be a retribution presidency. I think that's clearly what's happening. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal when Kash Patel was nominated, saying he wasn't competent to hold the job. I think I've been proven correct on that. I mean, I could go on, but you know.
Harvin from Austin asked, why would China invade Taiwan given our ability to blockade their energy and even food?
Well, I personally think it's unlikely China will invade Taiwan. I think it's across 100 miles of open ocean. They don't have an amphibious landing capability. Maybe more important, they don't want to destroy Taiwan. They want the chip manufacturing and the incredible industrial capacity on Taiwan whole. So I think what Beijing will do is create a political crisis under some pretext and throw a blockade around Taiwan. And the question then would be, will the U.S., Japan, others break the blockade and stand with Taiwan? In this administration, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm very worried about it.
Great. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to close with a quote from your book, which I, as a historian, really appreciated. History, however, is not made by impersonal forces, but by individuals. Nothing in politics is inevitable, and facts, even now, can shape politics, which I hope proves to be true. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.